soft human architecture of a life. Mei Lin recorded them in the attic of her mind as she used color to shore up fragments. There were practicalities as well. Lion gave Mei Lin maps of the alcoves, boxes, and little notes about which scraps were touchable and which were fragile beyond repair. Some are only to be looked at through the lattice of glass, Lion cautioned. The light itself can be a thief. Handle them after you have steadied your heart. Mei Lin grew into the role with the slow, stubborn attention of someone adding a new stroke to a familiar painting. She learned to recognize that some stains were not to be erased. A smudge on a sleeve might be the last place the emperor had touched after a fever. To remove it would be to erase a fidelity. She developed a philosophy of intervention. Restore less than must be restored. Expose the hue that anchors a memory but do not efface the passage of time. On the second evening, after a day of small repairs and whispered remembrances, Eunuch Rong arrived without announcement. His face, usually a mask of placid obsolescence, carried the look of a man forced to move a chess piece he never wished to touch. He passed a folded slip across the low table where Mei Lin had been spreading pigments dry to the light. The paper bore a red stamp, an imperial order of policy, but the rub of the wax felt like a hand on a throat. There are new audits, Rong said, his voice hushed though they were alone. The Grand Secretary has issued a renewed list of materials forbidden in private workshops. All artisans must register their pigments with the Bureau of Manufactures by the end of the week. Failure to comply will result in confiscation and investigation. The words landed like a stone dropped into the quiet pool of their work. Mei Lin gripped the table edge to steady herself. The alcove felt suddenly smaller, the candlelight too thin. Lion's jaw tightened. They will use it to find those who speak in color, she said. He thinks they can replace confusion with law, draw a straight line where life refuses one. Her fingers closed around the cedar wood of the chest as if it were an anchor. They will say pigments are factors of sedition. They will call beauty a temptation when what they fear is memory. Mei Lin thought of her grandmother's chants and Jiao's parables about color as living weathered people. She thought of the courier who had been captured months earlier and the small jars clinking in the dark. She had known political risk as an abstract knowledge, an ink smear on an edict, but now it was a visible lattice closing in. I will be careful, Mei Lin said at last, though she did not know precisely what careful would look like when the court's nets had been rewoven. We will be careful, but Lion did not let the phrase rest. Careful will not always be enough. Sometimes courage is a kind of care. Sometimes you must risk something visible to keep what is smaller and truer. Remember that when you choose a color, what you restore must be worth who will stand to lose it if discovered. Her eyes held the kind of steadiness one only sees in those who have lived with both kindness and fear in equal measure. Mei Lin left the alcove that night with the cedar chest's map burned into her memory and the image of a rose that was both faded and returned. The scraps were not trophies, they were instructions. Each stitch demanded fidelity, not only to form but to context. Each returned who would be a word in a sentence meant to reconstruct a man's sense of himself. As she walked back through corridors smelling of old paper and incense, she repeated the lesson aloud in the quiet of her head. Restore less than must be restored. Reveal memory without remaking the past. She felt the small, dangerous exhilaration of someone who has been given both the means and the motive to act. To be the medium of memory was to be entrusted with history's fragile interior. At the outer gate of the women's quarter, where moonlight slanted through the lattice like a measuring tool, Mei Lin halted and looked back. Within the palace there were now two kinds of light, the warm, private light of those who remembered, and the harsh, public light of policy that would soon sweep through workshops and storerooms. She thought of the crimson rose folded into Lion's palm and of the edict in Eunuch Rong's hand. She thought of Jiao at his kiln and of Scholar Lai Wei, who would surely argue for precedent and ritual if he could be summoned. She thought of the apprentices whose hands were still learning lest they become accomplices. She felt a small, irrevocable pivot inside herself. It was not yet courage. It was not yet defiance. It was the acceptance of obligation, a knot made by binding one's life to a project that could not be undone without cost. She held that knot for a moment, testing its strength, and then she walked on. The alcove's door closed behind her with a soft, certain sound. The cedar chest kept its breath and its treasures. Somewhere in the palace, in a different room where men in black robes discussed policy like geometry, a hand would soon draw a line that would sweep toward them. For a while longer, however, the rose would keep its red. For a while, the emperor's name would stir in the mouth of someone who had not yet forgotten. The work had become more than a craft. It had become a promise that she would keep even if it cost her everything. Outside, beneath the honeyed lattice of the inner yard, Mei Lin inhaled the cold night air. It tasted faintly of salt and wood smoke, and in it she could almost hear the remembered hum of a garden, an impossible thing to hold, and yet, tonight, not quite impossible. She tucked the image of the restored rose into the safe place in her mind where she kept recipes and names. She would carry it like a compass. And at the edge of her pocket, under her hand, her fingers brushed the small slip Eunuch Rong had handed her earlier, the printed notice of audits. She smoothed it once and then folded it carefully into her robe. The edict would follow them like an approaching tide. She could not know how high it would rise. But she knew now what she would do when it crested. The door to the alcove clicked shut behind them, and the palace breathed its secrets back into itself. The night held, for a moment, the smell of camphor and new pigment, the low thrum of shared confidences, and the small, fragile hope of a red rose waiting to be seen again. The council hall smelled of cold stone and worn ink, of incense too steady and too much like an attempt to sweeten something that would not yield to scent. A pale winter light came through the latticed windows and fell in thin bars across the long lacquered table where ministers sat in ordered rows, robes stiff with form and hands folded as if to prevent themselves from reaching for the past. The banners outside hung at half-mast, no, not half-mast. Simply slack their threads, had lost their arguments with color and sagged as if the wind itself had decided to forget how to make them speak. It was in that drawn hush that Grand Secretary Shen rose. He moved with the economy of a man who had learned to conserve everything, even gestures. His black robe seemed to drink the light around him. His face was a plane of severity with little softness at the edges. When he set a paper upon the table, a hush contracted, a cloth taken from the back of a body. The paper bore columns and characters, figures of grain yield, troop movement logs, lists of tax receipts, and of the imperial household's dwindling stores for dyeing and finery. Shen tapped a wooden stylus upon a number, and the sound was like a pebble on a dry clay floor. "We cannot pretend that the empire stands on ceremony alone," he said. His voice mapped itself onto the room with the surety of someone who had practiced this syllable until it had no inflection. Without color, the world has been described as pallid, but pallor is not the disease, it is the symptom. The disease is a rotted backbone, and what must be done is to set the bones straight. He let the image sit there. The ministers exchanged the quick, polite glances of people whose lives were measured by their ability to be useful to power and still invisible to it. Many had known famine or had married kin who had. The paper he had placed down did not burden them with a new dread. It asked them to remember old ones. "Look here," Shen said, and pointed to a column showing the last 5 years of provincial revenue. "Look at the decline. Look at the banditry reports. Where color returns, public gatherings grow bolder, color rallies memory, memory rallies sentiment, sentiment becomes mobilized. We saw what happened when rebellion seeded itself in song and banner in the South. The court must close the loop by denying the conditions that let that mobilization begin." A murmur, a minister with a weathered face, Minister Zhao, cleared his throat and nodded. He liked numbers, and numbers liked him back. If color is a kind of fuel, he offered, we must hoard the stores for the rites that preserve the dynasty. Nobody in the room argued with the need for rites. Rites were the rails on which the imperial chariot ran. But Li Wei, who sat near the window with an ink-stained cuff bunched at his wrist, and the smallness of his person in contrast to the vastness of his mind, lifted a hand. He had the air of a man who kept too many paper birds in his pockets. One might fly away and someone would have to retrieve it and pin a name to its wing. Rights do not live only by scarcity, Li Wei said slowly. He pressed his palms upon a brittle scroll and unfurled it with the reverence of a man opening a sealed letter from someone dead. The scroll's edge still held the ghost of blue where pigment had bled but not wholly vanished. Rights live by recall. A die that is hidden does not become safer. It becomes, instead, something to be desired in secret. Memory denied to the public becomes memory stolen. The people will not be reminded of what they have lost by forbidding it. They will long for it all the more. They will find other ways to keep it alive, and those ways are harder to steward. The room listened with an attention the way a body listens to a surgeon's blade, waiting to know whether it would heal or to see the scar left behind. Li Wei's face was a fine thing to look at. He had the sort of features that were rendered small by humility and large by thought. He recited an excerpt, an old couplet about the moon and lacquer that drew from memory what Shen would call insubstantial, but what Li Wei called sustaining. Color is not merely ornament, Li Wei said. It is a shorthand for lineage, for ritual, for the things that bind a people across time. By making it criminal, we render the very practice of remembering liable to suspicion. The state will lose not only beauty. It will lose the people's capacity to remember themselves as our ancestors taught the court to remember them. Shen's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He had a way of folding the world into a problem set, and for him the variables were clear: disorder, scarcity, the memory of rebellion. The South had fallen in the long ago of his formative years. He had seen how color-bearing merchants had been used to smuggle messages. He had seen how a simple lantern song grew into the cry that split village from governor. He had smelled the smoke and had returned to a ruined courtyard where a child had once called his name and did not call now because there was nothing left to call for. Emotion, Shen said, is the raw material of sedition. If you are sentimental about the emperor's recollections, you are not a statesman. You are a courtier softening the spine of governance. We must choose the empire or the indulgence. There is no third. The words landed like a thin slate across the hall. Some in the council stiffened. Others' published faces softened by the memory of dinners that were now simplifications of supply lines. The Grand Secretary's argument had the virtue of simplicity, and simplicity in the court was often the most persuasive weapon. It transformed a moral question into an operational one. Order versus chaos, and the cold logic of preservation favored shedding luxuries that might feed unrest. But Li Wei, who had prepared his rebuttal with a scholar's meticulousness, pursued a different logic. There is a long history of the court co-opting ornament to bolster authority, he said. We do not have the luxury of obliteration. If pigments and banners become contraband, they will not vanish. They will migrate into private rooms and to hidden ateliers. They will be used not in ceremony that we can oversee, but in gatherings we cannot control. What you call austerity may instead encourage the very ferment you fear. A younger minister, a man who had risen by the luck of an uncle's favor, and who wore silk with the hesitant style of the untested, tried a compromise. We could limit public use, he suggested, reserve certain pigments strictly for court ritual, while forbidding them in civic festivals. A cordon sanitaire around imperial usage, Shen's eyes cut to him. And who will enforce that cordon, the minister asked. Who decides which public moments are safe? We have provincial magistrates on the make. We have governors who traffic in imitation. You will engender an industry of forgery and counterfeit to skirt the law. You will create a market for rebellion's paraphernalia. Do you not remember the songs that came out of patched flags, minister? A tattered banner can become a standard. The minister's fingers pressed into the table. He had hoped to be remembered for an elegant compromise that would be his political epitaph. He found instead that the room's compass gave ways to only 2 poles, and he was being asked to choose his allegiance. We cannot legislate longingly, Wei said, softer this time. But we can steward it, make it part of the civic ritual that reminds people of their place in the dynasty's story. The forbidden dyes were outlawed not because they were dangerous pigments, but because of political acts that followed their possession. If the problem is instrumentalization of color, then reintroduce stewardship, not prohibition. Legislate ritual custodianship. Train artisans within the state's view, not beyond it. Shen shook his head in a movement that suggested something older than the matter on the table. You are Navi to trust stewardship, Lai Wei. When an empire loses force, people do not rally to process. They rally to feeling. Feeling is contagious. When the crowd sees a color that speaks of yesterday's fullness, they will make a story out of it and give it an end. I have lived through too many endings, scholar. Once, when I was sent to secure a province, I found a family huddled around a dim bowl and dividing boiled reeds like they were silk. I could not fix the harvest. I could not fix the roads. I made choices to bring stability, and those choices cost lives. I learned then that order must be paramount. Better a nation of pallor than a nation consumed by longing. For a long moment the council was held between 2 histories, one of restraint and hard necessity, the other of remembrance and cultivated continuity. Such moments are dangerous because hearts and minds in a room can tip like scales. Shen's argument had the austere melody of someone who had paid to learn his lesson on the battlefield and the famine lane. Lai Wei's argument had the warmth and hazard of the scholar who counted lineage not only as paper but as human pulse. When Shen finally spoke, his hand rose to a small chest at his side. From it he drew a thin slip of paper folded many times. He opened it like a man who had kept a wound dressed and now chose to reveal the scar. I offer compromise, he said. The court will limit the use of pigments in festivals and markets. We will codify designated ritual dyes for state observances. Workshops that apply for official oversight will be subject to inspection. Any clandestine manufacture, any illicit couriering will be punished not merely as economic crime, but as sedition. His voice did not waver, but an edge showed in the way his fingers tapped the table. Eunuch Rong, who had stood near the door and watched with the quick intelligence of someone who lived in the light of others' movements, saw the line of consequence before anyone spoke it aloud. The inspection orders meant lists, and where there were lists there would be names. Where there were names there would be people hunted in the night. He had seen such things happen in corridors far away from court banquets, small raids that emptied whole workshops and left stools with drying stains like the bodies of insects. And will the enforcement be carried out by the palace guard? Shen was asked. Or will it fall to provincial magistrates who are notoriously venal? Where there is profit in scarcity, men will find a way. The palace guard will have authority, Shen replied. We will deputize eunuchs for surveillance under the auspices of ritual preservation. We will grant them power to inspect, to inventory, to seize. This is not a law against beauty. It is a law for survival. The language of survival made hands fold more tightly. Minister Zhou looked pleased. He liked survival because it offered him a plateau to stand upon. The younger minister, who had wanted a compromise, looked less pleased. The palace guard, in his mind, could become a tool of vendetta, and vendetta is precise and ugly. Li Wei struck once more, though his voice carried the wariness of someone at the end of a long conversation, and newly conscious of how little words could do against entrenched fear. Make custody public, make the records transparent, he urged. If you must limit pigment, then do so with panels of elders, with recorded inventories and public accounting. Keep artisans within a recognized guild that reports to the court, but is not shackled to secrecy. That way those acts of memory remain available to be seen, argued over, refined. Secrecy breeds myth, and myth breeds the crowd. Shen folded his hands as if folding a list of names into the crease of his sleeve. His mouth formed a new kind of answer, not entirely a refusal but a kind of compression. The people have short memory for nuance, he said. They remember the one color and forget the context. If we prevent the public spectacle of color, we prevent the spectacle of grievance. The empire does not have time for nuance. Time, he said, and the word lodged like a nail. It was the pulse beneath his policy. He had no more time to unspool the slow arguments of scholars. He would make a move that would be quick and, to his eye, decisive. Then it is decided, Shen said at last. We will prepare a proclamation restricting pigment usage, ratify a system of supervised workshops, and dispatch inspectors to provincial centers. We will treat illicit manufacture as a matter of state security. We will not allow a color to become a banner for those who would unravel our order. When the seal was set to the decree, the sound of the brush on the red paste was small and private, and yet it carried through the hall like a bell. It was the sound of a choice made. Eunuch Rong bowed and took the list. He had in his pocket the knowledge that such lists were not only bureaucratic tools but rope. He thought of Mei Lin in the back of his mind, the quiet painter, with ink-stained wrists and a tendency to linger over faded sleeves. He thought about the smell of resin and ground ore that had become, in his nightly eavesdropping, an emblem of defiance. He wanted to warn, he wanted to protect, but his oath tethered him to discretion. Outside, the courtyard wind felt colder. The banners swayed like tired heads. Elsewhere in the city market, women continued to mend fabric and children chased each other with sticks that were gone to weather. The decree would ripple out slowly to magistrates who would find it a new instrument of power, to merchants who would seek profit in scarcity, to artisans who would either beg for registration or fold into the hidden world of uncounted hands. Lai Wei gathered his papers slowly, a scholar's careful resignation. He had not won the room. He had cast his argument. He took with him the small scroll with its trace of blue, slipping it beneath his sleeve like a secret petition on behalf of memory. Shen returned to his seat, but not to calm. His shoulders continued to show the coiled readiness of a man who had decreed a path, and was already imagining the steps along it, cold from old pains and hard-won lessons. The ministers dispersed like tattered leaves. Outside the council hall a messenger waited in the corridor, breath fogging his face in the cold. He took the sealed decree and shouldered it like a weight he had not asked for. The path of the paper would be 100 hands long before it reached the workshops and the market squares, and in those hands the inked seal would be read as law or as license to profit. In the quiet that followed, Shen lingered for a moment alone, his palms flat on the table as if feeling for the pulse of the wood beneath. He thought of a boy in a ruined lane, of a harvest that did not return, of a woman selling dyed ropes who had been taken in a night raid, and whose child had followed him with a look that he could not forget. He had chosen to armor the state in place of the softness of remembrance. In his chest something had hardened, and he took comfort from that hardness as others took comfort from song. And somewhere else, in a narrow studio lit by the sick light that remained to painters now, Mei Lin's brush might pause over a paper towel with a faint smear of blue, her hand holding still at the thought of what the morning might bring. The decree, when it arrived, would not speak her name. It would offer instead the architecture within which she must choose how loud her silence will be. At the threshold of the door the eunuchs moved like shadows who had learned the politics of breath. One of them, small and watchful, caught a glimpse of the messenger's cloak and felt a chill that was not merely of winter. The court had made its decision. The world of color had to decide whether to submit, to hide, or to burn bright in the dark. Outside the city walls, at the docks where Marina kept his handful of oars and stories of cobalt cliffs and salt pools, men unloading a crate heard a far-off bell and asked whether it was good or ill. The bell said only that something had shifted. In the weeks to come, patrols would visit workshops at dawn. A ledger line would be found out of place and a hand would be implicated. The Grand Secretary's logic was precise and rules sharpened into instruments. The only question left, that evening a question heard beneath the steady fall of night into cold, was whether walls built to keep out disorder might instead press a people so tight that the blood of memory had no place but to carve tunnels underground. The tunnel is where the forbidden grows luminous, and where those who love color learn to speak without a voice. The council's decision spread like an undertow, soundless at first and then sudden. The silk of a minor official's sleeves fluttered as he read the proclamation. A guildmaster in a far suburb put down his brush and considered the cost of registering. A young apprentice in a backstreet stall listened to someone, perhaps an old woman, hum a line of a song kept from a time when vermilion was common as tea. The Grand Secretary had chosen order over nuance, and in choosing, he had lit a torch that would either show the way back to discipline or set a path to confrontation. Night closed in. The seal still smelled faintly of red paste. Gio kept his confession like a rusted tool, always within reach, rarely used, and liable to wound the hand that tried. It was a damp night when he finally took it from his chest and set it on the table between himself and Mei Lin. Outside, the sea spoke low against the harbor piles, a steady exhale that had watched the capital's colors come and go for as long as Jiao could remember. Inside his workshop, lamps pooled light in bowls on the table. Jars, their mouths crusted in the fine dust of crushed minerals, caught the glow and turned it into a constellation of matte moons. Mei Lin listened as she had listened to her grandmother's songs without interruption, picking up the rhythms of truth as they arrived. She sat on a low stool, fingers clenched around the lip of her storage box, a small familiar weight of dried rice husks and wrapped fragments. The pestle and mortar by the door lay unused, an unspoken witness whose pale rim held the ghosts of 100 tiny experiments. It was 20 years ago, Jiao began, his voice rough as unsanded wood. We were young and afraid, and we held the work like an offering to an altar we could not afford. The men who needed bread were given a promise: carry this ore to the kiln, and pay will follow. We did not see the ravine then. We carried sacks to the hills and did not notice the way the earth had already been hollowed. His hand trembled, and he pushed a small cloth across the table. Inside was a faded scrap of a ledger and a torn photograph, a hillside of striped soil, a thatched roof. Children with smudged faces that had been full of color, and then faded in the years afterward. Mei Lin reached for the paper, the skin at her fingertips suddenly cold as if the harbor wind had found its way inside them. There was fever afterward, Jiao said. He closed his eyes and let the words unspool like rope. Rains failed. The miners drank salty well water. Children coughed. I thought the ore would bring work. It brought only hunger and sickness. My family begged me hide the recipe, Jiao. Hide it and leave it be. I could not. I thought if I could make it into a pigment, people would see. Maybe donors would come. We moved ore in barrels under moonlight. A gang came to that village wanting the veins. Later we heard there were men who raided the fields, men who sold the land. The priest there put out a bowl for us. The bowl cracked. The next spring, 3 girls were gone. He did not speak their names. He did not need to. Mei Lin felt a hot animal clench in her gut. The workshop seemed to tilt. For a long moment there was nothing but the modest tick of a cockroach on the wooden beam and the slow drip from a leaking eave. Her breath came and went like a small bell. You carried it? She asked finally, her voice too small to match the weight of the question. Yes, he said. I carried it. I thought the pigments could be given back to the world. I believed in the color's truth. Then I learned how little that protects the living. We are not artists only, we are participants. We took more than we offered. The confession was a wound and a reliquary. It altered the room's geometry.